guys, Rick Taylor with KS USA here. Today we're going to talk about how to service your first generation Supernatural, your Dropzone or Dropzone Remote seat post. So a couple things I want to talk about before we get started are some of the tools you're going to need. First is going to be a pair of soft jaws. If you can't find these, your other option would be to use the clamp on your bike stand if you have a service repair stand. I'd recommend, if you're going to clamp to the mast with a bike stand, to wrap a piece of old inner tube scrap around the mast so that you don't damage it. It also gives a little extra grip so you don't damage that. The other thing that you may need is a soft jaw system for the cartridge, and you can basically just get an axle vise to use for that. And so to get started here, we're just going to go ahead and take your post. To mount it up in the vise carefully. You don't want to over torque this. Get it just tight enough so it won't slip, but you don't want to over torque it and distort the mast. You don't want to do any damage there. Next step is going to be with an 11mm socket to remove this blue nut here. Sometimes when you go to remove the nut, it's going to want to unscrew that red end cap, and so to help stop that problem, what you want to do is you can either use this electric impact that we have, or just a regular ratchet and socket will work fine. But what you want to do first is just give it a quick little turn clockwise, like you're tightening it up. Okay, and what that'll do is that'll allow, there's a kind of a tooth here on the lock washer, and with an alloy nut, they bite pretty tight, and so by turning it clockwise first and then counterclockwise, it'll help break that loose and that cap will end up staying in place. So we're going to go ahead and set those aside. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to open the seal collar here. You want to take the seal collar, and that's going to turn counterclockwise. If you can do it by hand, go ahead and turn it by hand. If you're not able to turn it by hand, go ahead and put that back in the vise. What you're going to want to get is a strap wrench. This happens to be a Cobalt brand that we got from Lowe's. So we're going to go ahead and mount that on here. Cinch it down. The beauty of this thing is that it's all rubber surface, so you're not going to do any damage. Okay, once you get it loose, go ahead and unthread that. Now, if you've got a lot of dirt and crud built up here in this area, I'd probably recommend, before you take everything completely apart where contamination is going to get further inside, go ahead and wipe this all down. And that way the dirt that's on the outside doesn't get down inside the parts and make it more difficult to clean up. Okay, so we've got that off, and now your DU bushing is pressed inside. So generally speaking, you can pull and it'll pop out. Now, if in the process of you pulling this, you notice that the inner bushing surface starts to raise up or pop out, then what you want to do is take a small flat blade screwdriver and just catch the edge there and give that a little tap, and that'll pop it out. What you want to avoid doing is, if you keep yanking on this, these guide bushings here are going to push that inner bushing out and possibly do some damage. So if you go pulling on it and it doesn't pop right out, go ahead and use that technique to avoid any damage. And when you pull these out, sometimes these copper guide bushings tend to want to pop out, so keep your hand under it so you can catch it. And we'll slide that assembly out. You'll also notice that there's a bottom out bumper here. In our case, it came out on the shaft. It stayed in place. Sometimes when you pull that out, this may not come out on the shaft. It may stay down inside. So in that case, you're going to want to take the mast out. Just tap it a couple times so that that pops back out. What's important is that when we put this back together, this piece is going to need to go back on the mast, or on the shaft rather. If it doesn't and you jam this in, you're going to do damage to this, and it's not going to do its job on the bottom out. So our first step is probably going to be to go ahead and clean this out, and depending on how dirty it is inside and whether or not you've got water from either pressure washing or hosing the bike down or riding in wet conditions, that's probably the hardest thing on the seat post, is the wet conditions inside. So if you do a lot of riding in wet conditions, or you do hose your bike down, make sure you check these things frequently and do this service that we're doing often to prevent contamination and corrosion and that kind of thing. But what I'd recommend doing is we get these microfiber towels, We're just using simple green, but any biodegradable degreaser works good. You just want to kind of saturate a clean rag. And then down inside here, you'll see there's a roller clutch system, and that's important to get all the grit and dirt out. And the way you do that is just roll back and forth. And as you're doing this, you'll notice the stuff's coming off, and that you'll see the shiny brass rollers in there. As they start to look clean and shiny, and that race inside there that's white plastic starts to look clean, that's what we're after. We want to get all the grit and dirt, water, any contamination out of that surface, so that those roller clutches are free and will begin to work properly again. Now, if you've got a lot of dirt and contamination all the way down the mast, then what I'd recommend doing is to just go ahead and take the microfiber towel like this. If you've got a long screwdriver, that works good. If you don't have a long screwdriver, basically anything that's a long shaft that can push through there, even a coat hanger if you cut a section of it. But the idea is to just take this microfiber towel and push it through. And when you see you're down to the end of it here, go ahead and draw it back out. And what it'll do, all those little fibers are going to get inside the raceways, and inside you have little grooves that the bushings are going to ride in. And you want to get those really clean and make sure that there's no contamination inside those. So once this is clean, we'll go ahead and set it aside. Now we'll take this bottom out bumper and we're going to set it aside here with the other parts. The next step, if you just take a knife, you can catch the edge of these bushings. I'm going to pop all three of those out. Then your DU bushing will slide off. You can kind of check it at this point too. It should slide pretty easily, but if you move it side to side, there really shouldn't be any play. If you find that there's a lot of play there, you might want to check with your local bike shop or local distributor to get a new DU bushing. Those drop in, they're easy to replace, and now would be a good time to replace it if you detect that it's loose. If it's tight, you might want to do the same thing. You might have been some damage to that bushing at some point and you want to replace it. So if it feels good and everything's working well, just go ahead and take that and clean it. Real simple, just wipe off all the old grease and contamination. Set that aside. The next thing we're going to do is take the seal collar off. What we want to do here is clean the seal. Now that it's clean, we want to check the sealing surface, and so there should be a good clean kind of sharp edge on the rubber all the way around the seal, and there's an outer and an inner edge. You want to make sure that that's consistent. If you see any cracks, any damage, anything like that, it's a good time to replace. Now you don't have to replace the whole collar. The seal actually is replaceable, and you can just catch that with your fingernail, pop it out, the new one pops in place. In our case, this one's in real good shape, so we just cleaned it, and now we're going to go ahead and lube it. So what we recommend using for lube is KS post paste. In the absence of that, you can also use Slick Honey. It's a suspension specific lube, and what it does really well is stay in place with a light viscosity. If you use a lithium grease or a Teflon fortified, like a PTFE fortified grease, a lot of times you'll have an interaction problem with the Teflon bushing. The stuff becomes gummy and sticky. A lot of them break down really quickly with water. So you just want to make sure that you're using a good grade grease like the Slick Honey or Post Paste. So what we're going to do is just pack that into the seal. There's a bit of a cavity that's created between the two seal surfaces, and what we're doing is we're filling that with the grease. And it does two things. One, it pre-lubes the stanchion, but more importantly, if you're in wet conditions, that extra barrier of grease prevents water from getting inside. Basically, now our next step is going to be to lube the roller bearing. The way we're going to do that is you want to take a sizable amount of grease and just force it down, push it in to the bearing. And what you'll see as you push it in is the grease is going to go in the front side of the roller, squeeze around, and you'll see it kind of squirt back up out of the back. And that's what we're looking for. You want to get grease packed all the way in there. Okay, we can set that aside. Okay, so now that we've got this apart, it's a good idea for us to take off the actuator. This is a 2mm Allen. And we're going to go ahead and pull this out. Okay, so regardless of which model, what we're looking for is to go ahead and clean the actuator and get rid of any grit or dirt that's on that and set that aside. Next thing we want to do is clean the plunger or the piston that's inside here. Sometimes you have a little dirt, it'll build up in there. So we'll take a little bit of biodegradable degreaser, just use a screwdriver with your microfiber towel, and get in there and clean that really good. If it's really caked up and you have an air compressor at home, some compressed air with a nozzle to blow in there will help clean that out. But the goal is to get all the grit and debris out of here. And then we want to go ahead and wipe down the rest of the cartridge and the shaft. And now's a good time to look for any damages, any chips or anything like that. If there's anything that's extreme damage that might compromise the seal, then you might consider talking to your local dealer about getting a new cartridge. If everything looks to be in order and is clean, then we can go ahead and start the reassembly process. So the first step, we've already pre-lubed this seal collar, so we're going to slide it on. The next step is the DU bushing. We'll slide that in place. Our next step is to take a little bit of that grease and push it into each of these 3 little machine grooves. Then we're going to take the lower guide bushings. I'm going to set those in place and put a little more grease on top of them. What happens when we put the grease in is that just helps those bushings adhere to the shaft in the groove and makes it a lot easier to reassemble. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and put the bottom out bumper on the shaft. Next step, you've got to kind of pay attention to the orientation of this bearing. There's 3 grooves here in the bearing, and those grooves correspond to these 3 bushings. So what generally is the easiest way to do is line it up so that your bushings or bearings are just to the right of those grooves. Slide it in and then go ahead and turn it counterclockwise while kind of pushing in with light force, and you'll feel it start to go. It'll start to go in and the 3 bushings will line up. What you then want to do is take 3 fingers and hold these and continue to push them in until they go all the way in. The reason we're holding them is if you don't, sometimes they'll want to jump out, they'll get out of the raceway, and as you push them in, you could bend or damage those bushings. So be really careful when you install those. And we'll go ahead and take the seal collar and just tighten that down hand tight. Then our next step is to put on our lock washer and that blue nut. Now you notice there's an area on the blue nut that we've lost a little bit of the anodizing, and that's because it was tightened down on the nut. So go ahead and put that side back down on the lock washer. We're going to tighten it, and again, if you're going to use an impact, you don't want to go crazy with this because you'll break that shaft off in there. What you want to do is run it up until it stops, and essentially what happens is the lock washer, the 2 ends are like this, and as you tighten it down, the 2 ends of the lock washer are going to line up. So when you look down inside here, if you see that both ends of the lock washer are flush, that's tight enough. Don't tighten it any tighter. So in this case, that's it. That's tight. Okay. Next step, we'll go ahead and put this back in our vise. It's a good idea before you put the strap wrench back on it to just wipe this down with a little degreaser and the microfiber towel, because grease on the surface is going to get all over your strap wrench and it's not going to be very effective. And again, you get this hand tight and go about a 1/4 turn past hand tight, and that's tight enough for the seal collar. Okay, our last step is going to be to go ahead and put this actuator back in. And again, it doesn't matter which model you have, this process is going to be the same. We're going to put a little dollop of grease here. We have the actuator pivot pin. That's the one that you use with the 2mm Allen. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on that. You want to make sure that's lubed up because that's what this actuator pivots on. We're going to go ahead and reinstall that. Tighten that down about a 1/4 turn past hand tight. Wipe it down. Test the function. And you're ready to go ahead and install that back on the bike.